Okay, this is the first of two chapters that deal with ethics in policing, this one focusing on the nature of policing and police corruption. So let's start in thinking about policing and how it's evolved. So originally, the English concept of policing emphasized the need to obtain the goodwill of citizens in performing their police duties. And when policing came to the US, there was little concern about adhering to legal norms. Police did not get very much training, and justices and attorneys also did not have much training. So it was basically common for police to earn rewards for running rackets, right? So when you think of rackets, rackets is like racketeering, which is what organized crime is. And their main expertise then was knowledge of the underworld. Violence became an accepted norm, and police were really able to punish wrongdoers as they saw fit. And they were really expected to resort to violence and to not make arrests. And in the 1930s, we start to begin to see the era of reform, and policing has really changed since then. The function focuses now on crime control and enforcement of the law with the idea of controlling crime. And the primary function of the police is peacekeeping. They only spend about 10 to 15% of their time enforcing the law. So this is just, a reminder that policing isn't what it looks like on TV. You're not spending your entire shift running around in car chases, chasing down bad guys. So we've got a couple models of policing. The crime fighter model really pits criminals as the enemy, and the job of the police is to be punitive, okay? This really risks getting focused on the ends justifying the means. It condones invasions of privacy and abuse of power. And the media really constructs these images of the police as fighters against evil and protectors of society. So offenders are very clever, they're motivated by greed, and the interests of justice are not well served by liberal judges. We have three other models. The emergency operator, and this is when we think about police as we think about other first responders and emergency personnel, and they're clearing the way for professionals like social workers. So they're dealing with people rather than fighting crime. The social enforcer role is really looking at coercion as a central feature. The day-to-day problems may require the use of force in order to solve them. And the social peacekeeper incorporates the crime fighter and social service models and reflects a variety of duties. Okay, so let's think about policing as an institution. Is policing a profession or is it a bureaucracy? So a profession is considered a paid occupation that involves prolonged training and formal qualifications. A bureaucracy is a system of government in which most of the important decisions are made by state officials rather than elected representatives. In terms of a profession, we also see a lot of discretionary authority. We see the police as providing a public service. One thing that police are missing in this regard, though, is higher education. And for some, there is special expertise, but for many, there is not. Professions also emphasize ethical ideals and a service ideal. So police often use rhetoric of professionalism, but it doesn't necessarily have all the elements of professions, although we are certainly moving in that direction. So another piece to think about when we think about policing is the police culture. All institutions have a culture. That's the values, attitudes, and norms of that institution. And that determines the way activity is performed. So things that police deal with all the time, immorality, violence, lies, teamwork is really essential. But there's also a lot of secrecy that's endemic to police work. How do police acquire these values? Through their training process. And enforcement of the law isn't limited just to the question of whether an offense has been committed, but also includes the nature of the suspect. So we also, research often shows us that demeanor, degree of cooperation with police, race, age, and social class also impact these decisions. And showing disrespect is considered a matter of great concern. I think if you kind of look at many of the police shootings that we've seen, the wrongful police shootings we've seen in recent times, you can often see that there was an issue where the police often felt disrespected, and they may have resorted to excessive force or use of force as a result of that. When we think about this, a lot of times police culture also includes the idea that they shouldn't hesitate to use force against people who deserve it. And oftentimes police culture views due process as a process that protects criminals and really kind of handicaps them in carrying out their job. There's also overriding principles of loyalty and protecting their colleagues. And some may feel that because they engage in dangerous work, it's appropriate to accept gifts from the public. These values, though, certainly the negative values have weakened over time. There's a lot more diversity within police. Unions are able to defend individual officers. We have obviously seen in this day and age a rise of investigative journalism and citizen journalism. And many chiefs have taken steps to counter the negative aspects of police culture. So there's three big dominant characteristics here: cynicism, force, and the police being seen as victims. So of course, if you work with offenders regularly, you're going to start to develop a bit of a cynical viewpoint. Many people might be seen as a problem, especially if we can categorize them into a type. Force, whenever a threat is perceived, can be used against the authority of the officer, and it can be both expressive, it's a symbol of authority and dominance, and instrumental in that it keeps people in line. We also see police as victims of the public, misunderstanding, low wages, and vindictive administrations. So police have discretion by law, and also the right to use force, and discretion is absolutely necessary in this field. The police certainly cannot enforce every single law and arrest every single person who breaks the law. But the public is generally unclear as to how much authority the police actually have. So they do have broad freedom to make decisions. They can investigate something or decide it's not worth it, make an arrest or not. They have decisions about how much force to use. And a lot of times guidelines may be unclear. So what are ways that discretion gets limited? Well, some of it happens through judicial rulemaking, through court cases that make their way up through the court system, and appeals courts, and the Supreme Court make rulings. Legislative rules, and internal codes and regulations. But think about how hard this is to do. How can you codify the right response to the variety of situations a police officer is going to encounter? Some police officers, of course, are going to abuse this discretion. Discretion seems to be broader at the bottom and narrower at the top, and most citizens do support wide discretion. But that also means then that there has to be a matching level of accountability. So the Code of Ethics for Policing isn't even formed until 1928, and most departments have their own, but there's also one that's been developed by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. There's a lot of rhetorical language there to assure the public that police do follow standards. It's often used in academies as a teaching tool. And the idea here generally is to do the right thing even when no one is watching. I think if you think back to virtue ethics that we talked about earlier, that's kind of a nice, easy little rule to follow, right? So issues we have to think about. One thing we have to think about is the stress and the toll that policing takes on a police officer. This is a high stress, high strain occupation. Officers may develop PTSD, especially after shootings. PTSD, in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, it's acute trauma disorder. But PTSD is after, I believe, 6 months of symptoms. This can include flashbacks, sleeping problems, time distortion, emotional reactions. We hear about this a lot when we think about soldiers coming back from war. In about the mid to late 20th century, we start researching police stress. In 2000, we see the first confidential hotline for police and their families. And we want to remember that police are exposed to more acute stressors than most occupations. Combine that with the fact that suppressing emotions is sort of a requirement of the job, and we can kind of see a real recipe for disaster in terms of health. So policing organizations are capricious, unpredictable, and punitive, and officers often feel at risk from politics, supervisors, and uncertain events. There can also be a lack of support at home, not because somebody's significant other doesn't want to support them, but it can be very difficult to understand the job. And even when people do, oftentimes police officers don't want to bring home the kind of stuff they deal with to their families. Another stress that we often don't think about is just what happens to us when we do shift work. So if you've ever done shift work, you know that you've got interrupted sleep, and this can impact your health in a variety of ways. Police officers also have heavy workloads, Most of them are working heavy overtime and a lot of interaction with the public. And even people who are supportive of the police, think about most of your interactions with the police. When are you calling them? Or when are you interacting with them? Well, you've been pulled over, and even if it's your fault, you're probably stressed out and not happy about getting a ticket. Or you've been a victim of a crime or a witness to a crime. So even if you're not an offender, most of the time when we're interacting with the police, it's not a good day for us. Now imagine what that's like for the police on a daily basis to be dealing with people that, might not be in the best control of their emotions. This occupational stress then can undermine their effectiveness. There could be high turnover, poor morale, and as I mentioned, issues with health. Police who do experience high levels of stress often report physical issues, poor health, which then leads to people being absent from work, burnout, job dissatisfaction, and may even retire early. So in large departments, stresses can also be associated with the levels of discipline and regulation and just problems with how the agency is run. In small departments, there may be less crime and more community policing, and that might make police officers feel more connected to the community. They might be feeling more support from the community and therefore experiencing less crime. However, the violent crime rate is not associated with police stress, interestingly enough. We also want to remember that every interaction the police have, every call they get, even every single person they pull over, there is the potential for danger and serious danger. So we tend to think of the danger that police face as being this sort of explosive incident, a crime in progress, or as we've been seeing on the news lately, many mass shootings and school shootings. They're sort of daily tensions, right? Things that corrode their confidence and resilience. And then there could be things that are implosive, that challenge their values and bring about internal conflict. So in 2013, 111 officers died on duty. But it's important to note 33 were due to firearms, 46 in traffic incidents, and 18 due to job-related illness. They had heart attacks on the job. That stress, when your stress levels are constantly rising and dissipating, that causes problems for your body. So heart disease is very common with police, and stress is also associated with problem drinking. So how do police cope with stress? Well, many of us don't cope with stress very well, but you also want to think back to what we just talked about in terms of police culture. Police culture is similar to military culture in that it's just sort of expected that you can cope with that, right? Many police officers may cope through alcohol use, but it's really not a profession where you're encouraged to seek mental health help. Individual coping strategies are the same as they are for all of us. Do you have a good support system? Are you able to communicate your concerns? Do you exercise and eat well? Do you have outside interests in recreational activities? Taking vacation time? So in 2003, Griffin and Bernard proposed that the use of extra legal force can be explained by angry aggression. So let's start by thinking about extra legal force. So police are authorized to use force, and there's times in which that is legal, okay? When you step outside of what's allowed, right, and it's deliberate, knowing, and wrongful use, that's extra legal force. So this theory starts to explain violent responses to minor conflicts. This can be triggered by people who are experiencing chronic physiological arousal. So again, that stress of like your fight or flight instincts constantly being triggered. This happens in high stress jobs where there's a lot of, oops, there could be real danger, and then there's not. Oops, there could be real danger, and then there's not. So perhaps police are transferring some of this aggression to targets in their immediate environment. Another more recent issue involves the militarization of police. So the federal government has a program where they sell off excess military equipment to police departments. And this has really resulted in a militarization of police. And we didn't see much attention about this until the incident in Ferguson, Missouri, in August 2014, when a white police officer shot and killed an 18-year-old black male. Police handled it by sending in police with military-type weapons and body armors. And we want to think about, not that there aren't times where that's necessary, but if we misuse it, the message that's sending to the community. So law enforcement has really in some ways become militarized. And what are the consequences of that? Is it good for policing? Is it good for the community? So since 1776, the U.S. has sought to keep the military out of civilian affairs. After the Civil War, the Confederate States divided into military districts and were placed under military control, and therefore military became the principal law enforcement agents. In 1878, the Posse Comitatus Act prohibited military involvement in domestic law enforcement. During World War I, it's suspended so that the police could aid in, the military could aid in policing domestic unrest, mostly because the National Guard was deployed overseas. And then that was weakened in 1981 and amended again to allow the military to participate in the war on drugs. Now, the Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act allows the DoD to share information and the military to provide advice and assistance to local police. It also can provide aerial surveillance for intercepting drug shipments. So the militarization thesis says that there's been this little noticed change in distinctions between military and police, war and law enforcement, and internal and external security. And there's two pieces we see here: the militarization of the police and the policeization of the military. So Kraska, so there is some support for his argument. There's been weakening of law preventing military involvement in policing, and a lot of cooperation between police and military in terms of sharing technology, information sharing, task force dealing with drug control and terrorism. We've seen a growth in routine use of SWAT teams and a tendency to rely on war and military models in designing crime control. Kraska does distinguish between militarization and militarism. So militarism is a set of beliefs, assumptions, and values that stress the use of force and threat of violence as the most appropriate means to solve problems. Militarization is then the implementation of that ideology. So adopting and applying central elements of the military model to law enforcement. Now, the police have always been militarized to some extent. How militarized they are, we can see in the types of weapons they use, military styles such as combat dress, the use of a command structure, and even in operational factors like, SWAT teams for no-knock warrants. So Krasko did some research and said that based on this research, about 89% of police departments serving populations of 50,000 plus had established a paramilitary unit. And this was a doubling from the 1980s. Between 1980 and 2000, we've seen a 1,400% increase in their deployment. So there's about 45,000 deployments of SWAT teams every year. And this began with the war on drugs. It's not related to an actual growth of incidents for which SWAT teams are designed. And regardless of town size, more than 80% of deployments for drug raids, were for drug raids with no-knock warrants. This often is used in what we call hotspots. In 2014, the ACLU looked at 818 SWAT incidents from more than 20 agencies and found 7 involved citizen deaths. 62% of SWAT callouts were for drug searches, 79% involved raids on private homes, and only 7% involved the categories for which SWAT teams were designed: hostage, barricade, and active shooter. So when we start to use SWAT teams outside of their use, this may encourage the development of a warrior mentality, which is obviously the exact counter of community policing. So officer safety does not appear, according to research, to be a genuine threat in many situations where warrants are being served. The ACLU believes SWAT teams should not be used based solely on probable cause for the presence of drugs. Now, SWAT use in terms of drug searches, 54% were for minorities, 42% were Black, and 12% were Latino. So they're primarily impacting people of color. Now, what are the causes of this militarization? We touched a little bit upon the war of drugs and also the war on terror. And both have really shaped policing through this militaristic rhetoric. But there aren't any empirical studies on how and why police departments came to form SWAT units. But think about it. SWAT teams and elite teams are really associated with quote-unquote real police work. And there's generally a reward of high status for people who are members of these teams. Now, the war on drugs is declared in the 70s by Nixon, and it's conducted by the DEA and local police agencies. And popular support for this war increased so much that by 1989, 40% of the public thought illegal drugs were the primary problem facing the U.S. Holland Coyne suggests there's an indirect militarization, and this occurs when police departments engage in what's called mission creep, with the aim of expanding the range of their activities and increasing their spending. So police departments may expand their operations to get additional funding and staff. Then they're sort of faced with the incentive to use that additional staff and training and equipment to justify the increase and to get further funding. Holland Coy also argued that actual and perceived crisis and moral panics allow the government to expand programs. So, for example, even just thinking about since the end of the Civil War, the police routinely recruit veterans. There's no studies on how this affects police culture or tactical perspectives. So what are some consequences then of militarization? So there's an argument here that this really begins in the 60s. Daryl Gates, who's the chief of the LAPD, decides that traditional police tactics were inadequate to deal with riots and looting and forms the first SWAT team. And it's first deployed with assistance from the Marine Corps against the Black Panthers. Maryland deployed a SWAT team on average of 4.5 times per day in 2014, and more than 93% of them were to execute search warrants, 60% of which were for nonviolent crimes. Here we've got a list of some inappropriate and reckless use of SWAT, and there's quite a few of these, and they're covered in your textbook, so you might want to take a minute to I don't want to read them all to you, but to take a minute to kind of look them over in the book or to look them over in the slides. So Hill and Berger argue that militarization then runs counter to the democratic policing ideals and encourages a perspective that inner cities are war zones, which then really kind of targets and sets up the underclass as the enemy. Jeffers argued that the public accepts law enforcement resemble soldiers because of the rhetoric of fear associated with violent crime. And terrorism fears are constantly warning you that the enemy is close by. So there are some critiques of this. This is a theory, and as we mentioned, there's not a lot of research on it, right? So there's not a lot of evidence. Waddington asserts that SWAT teams could not have expanded beyond LA without political support, and the fact that the public generally was apathetic towards police tactics. International studies show no correlation between public approval of the police and the weapons they carry. Waddington also rejects the argument that SWAT teams constitute a warrior culture. All right, let's talk a little bit about police corruption. This covers a lot of practices, ignoring small jobs for large visible ones. And we can see here a typography of just a variety of different things that can constitute police corruption. Fixing tickets, internal payoffs, opportunistic theft, shakedowns. So what justifications or explanations do police and others offer to explain the existence of police corruption? Okay, there's the idea of a rotten apple, right? One bad apple spoils the bunch. There's a recruitment perspective. Officers are recruited from similar backgrounds, so they have similar values. And police personality perspective, where the culture creates that police personality. We also have an institutional approach, which says that police discretion makes corruption likely. So there's a lot of secrecy within the institution, and there's a lot of low public visibility, and people are not visible to their supervisors. And then there's systemic explanation that's dealing with pressures placed upon police. That's a lot of P's by society. So let's talk about drugs. So illegal drugs are obviously a major contributing factor to police corruption. There's a large amount of money and a willingness of dealers to bribe police. Victims are unlikely to report when they've been victimized by a drug dealer. Um, and because addiction is seen as a medical condition, perhaps that corruption seems less morally damning. In 1998, a government report found that half of all police officers convicted following FBI investigations were convicted for drug offenses. So, some of the things that, are often talked about in regards to police corruption is that, there's a lot of rules forbidding small practices. And that's because of concerns of a slippery slope. That something might start out on a small scale and eventually develop into a grander scale. So one argument here is we should what is wrong with me today? Decriminalize those activities which most easily tempt police into graft. Now, noble cause corruption starts with the encouragement to accept free meals. And then someone might test the willingness of your willingness to back up other officers. Physical violence against suspect, and also what's called flaking drugs, planting drugs on a suspect. So what are some causes of corruption? Well, first of all, the people that you're dealing with now have influence over you as a police officer. It also subverts you from your proper role, creates conditions that favor crime, and that make permit crime to flourish. And it also diminishes your credibility and undermines public trust in police. Well, what are some ways we can combat this? Recruitment. We want to try to recruit those with the highest moral character. We also want to reduce opportunities for corruption by rotating officers that are in drug squads. We also want to try to detect and deter corruption. We need to investigate. We need to think about how we use informants. And we also want to reinforce people's motivation to act morally. Morally, not normally. So, what do we do when we have someone who is engaging in whistleblowing? There's two types: internal, where you report it to someone in the organization, and external, where you report it to outside agents. So I think one thing that's really different in criminal justice is that there can be a real danger to whistleblowing. People often face a heavy price. They could be fired, they could be demoted, but more importantly, you're relying on your fellow police officers for support and for your safety. So whistleblowers should be offered some type of protection when they're reporting corruption. Okay, so when is it morally justified to blow the whistle? Well, when it's done in good faith to expose wrongdoing. You should exhaust all other options. Make sure you have proper evidence. Also, think about the seriousness of the misconduct. The action should be consistent with general responsibility of a citizen and where you think you're going to have some chance of success. Now, what about discrimination as a form of corruption? So racial discrimination is the process through which, in terms of policing, police stigmatize, harass, criminalize, or otherwise discriminate on the basis of social markers or national origin. So this is discrimination in the enforcement of law based on race. Can be the use of racist language. I'm back here in the projects, pissing off the natives. And those things serve to label, dominate, and control citizens. Now, Denver did a study where they found police were only slightly more prejudiced than the community as a whole. But studies also consistently find that police in minority areas believe they receive less respect from the public. Racial profiling. Officers are trained to be suspicious and search for criminal activity. But they often develop a perceptual shorthand. And we've talked about this in other classes. How do we decide if someone is dangerous, right? We often look to sort of shortcomings of what we think dangerous people look like. That could be their dress, their demeanor, their gender, their age. And so often what happens is young, low-income ethnic males are likely to be stopped and questioned, and perhaps more likely to be arrested. Some of this, again, might come back to this perceived disrespect shown to the police. And while police use excessive force against whites twice as much, they're reversed in cases of deadly force. So in the 1960s and 70s, the police fatally shot 7 blacks for every 1 white. Once the fleeing felon rule was declared unconstitutional, it's now 3 blacks for every 1 white. I just made that sound like that was okay or better. It's better, but it's not okay. Almost half of victims of excessive police force defied the officer's authority or resisted arrest. How, though, are we deciding when someone is being disrespectful? African American suspects were more likely to be disrespectful than whites. Class, however, tends to be the bigger determining factor here as opposed to race. In San Diego, nearly half those stopped and questioned were African American, even though the population is 17.5% and 4.8% of the population in those two precincts. Everyone stopped was male and 60% were juveniles. Now, this is often justified as an effective crime fighting measure and as an effective deterrent. Also, selectivity in how we choose to enforce the law, how we're using our discretion can also affect a discrimination. So in domestic violence cases, there's often a pattern of non-interference unless it involved a felonious injury, with a priority given to family solidarity. So what are some explanations then for police corruption? As we mentioned a little while ago, right, we have these individual approaches and then this institutional approach. We talked about this a little while ago, so I'm going to skip over those. And that wraps up the first chapter on police.